This video will cover the formulas in Excel that you can use to answer questions involving conditions. Now let's take a look at the first question. This question wants us to find the total DBH of trees that have a DBH that is greater than 15 centimeters. If you were to use the normal sum formula, you would need to go through the DBH data and look for all of the DBH data that are greater than 15 centimeters. To simplify this process, we can use the SUMIF formula, which would allow us to find the total value of the data based on one condition. So here we would write equal sign and then SUMIF. And here at the bottom, we can see the guide that shows us how we can write this formula. The first component of this formula is the cell range that corresponds to the criteria. The second component is the criteria itself, and then the last component will be the cell range that you want to find the total of. Here, the criteria is DBH that is greater than 15 centimeters. So the cell range that corresponds to that criteria would be the cell range containing the DBH data. Next, we would enter the criteria as greater than 15. And since the greater than symbol is a non-numeric data, we would need to write the criteria in quotation marks. And finally, since we want to calculate the total DBH, we would also use the DBH range as our sum range. And once you press enter, it will return the total DBH of trees that have a DBH greater than 15 centimeters. Now, let's take a look at the second example. Here, the question is asking for the total height of species F trees. And since we are looking for the total value of a certain data with one condition, we can again use the SUMIF formula. You can pause the video here if you want to try figuring out the SUMIF formula for this question by yourself first. Here, since the criteria is species F, we would select the range that corresponds to the species data. For the criteria, we would type in F in quotation marks because again, this criteria involves a non-numeric data. Finally, we would select the height data as our sum range because this question is looking for the total height of trees. In this example, we want to find the total height of trees. But in this case, there are two conditions. The first condition is that the tree is of species C, and the second condition is that the trees have a DBH that is less than or equal to 15 centimeters. Because we are dealing with more than one condition, we would need to use the SUMIFS formula with an S to find the total height of trees that meet these conditions. At the bottom, we can again see the way to write this formula, and you can see here that the components of this formula are the exact same as the SUMIF formula. However, the order is switched around, and now the sum range goes in the beginning, and the criteria range and the criteria come after the sum range. This order makes sense because this would allow us to more easily add more criteria as we go. Now, if we look at the example, here we want to find the total height, so our sum range would be the height. The first criteria is species C, so for the criteria range, we would select the species data, and for the first criteria, we would write C in quotation marks. Now we would add in the second criteria, which is DBH that is less than or equal to 15 centimeters. So for the second criteria range, we would select DBH, and for the second criteria, we would write less than or equal to 15 in quotation marks. Next, we want to count the number of trees with a DBH of less than 10 centimeters. And so since we are counting the number of certain variable with one condition, we will need to use the COUNTIF formula. For the COUNTIF formula, we would just need to write the range that corresponds to the criteria and the criteria itself. So in this case, since we're looking for trees with DBH of less than 10 centimeters, we would select the DBH data for the range, and for the criteria, we would write less than 10 in quotation marks. In this last question, we want to find the average DBH of trees that are of species F. So since we are looking for the average of a variable with one condition, we would need to use the average if formula. The components and the order for the average if formula is the exact same as the sum if formula. So first, we would need to select the range that corresponds to the criteria. Then we enter the criteria. And lastly, the range that you want to find the average of. In this example, for the range, we would select the species data. For the criteria, we would write F with quotation marks. And finally, since we are looking for the average DBH, we would select the DBH data for the average range.